I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review, and this is the Book Review Podcast. This week we have dueling Alexandras on the show. First, our reporter Alexandra Alter will join to talk about two wonderful pieces from recent weeks, both having to do with romance fiction. The first is about Georgette Heyer, the queen of Regency romance, and the debates that are occurring around her work a half-century after her death. The second is about Rebecca Yarros, author of one of this year's most surprising bestsellers, the romance fantasy or romantasy novel Fourth Wing. Then, Alexandra Jacobs, one of our staff critics, joins me to talk about her review of My Name is Barbra, the long-awaited memoir by Barbra Streisand. Let's turn now to the first of our Alexandra conversations. I'm here with our reporter, Alexandra Alter. Alexandra, thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, Alexandra, you recently reported out two great stories, and it just so happens that they both center on the romance genre, though once you get past that, they're quite divergent. I was wondering if we could talk about the first one. It's about Georgette Heyer, who, as you put it, was, quote, one of the most popular and influential romance authors of all time. Your story focuses on the debate over whether or not stereotypes in her work should be revised in new editions. But I'd love if you could first tell us about Heyer herself.
She is a fascinating figure, and I didn't know much about her when I started on the story, though she has a very devoted fan base even today. She died in the 1970s, but her books are still widely read by romance fans. And she's credited with inventing the Regency romance, which people know now because of Bridgerton. It's an incredibly popular subgenre in romance, and she was super prolific. In her lifetime, she wrote more than 50 novels. She wrote mysteries as well, but was best known for her very deeply researched Regency romances. She uncovered all these historical facts and packed them in, and other authors would copy her. They would just lift the facts out of her books and use them. And she's known for being very witty, really sharp social observations. She had some very kind of subversive feminist themes in her book that were ahead of their time. But the interesting debate about her work that's emerged, and it's gotten louder in recent years, is the pieces of her work that haven't aged as well, particularly stereotypes about people from other countries, about working class people, a lot of Jewish stereotypes, particularly in this novel, The Grand Sophie, which is one of her most beloved books, but has this very egregious kind of anti-Semitic stereotype in one scene that has bothered readers for a long time. So what drove this story actually was learning that a romance publisher in the U.S., Source Books, was editing that scene to soften it, to make it more palatable, and to remove the anti-Semitic stereotypes. And as I talked to the publisher and talked to Heyer scholars, I figured out how uncomfortable this process is and how complicated it is. And of course, it's come up in the work of Roald Dahl, in the work of Agatha Christie. It's just this debate that keeps recurring in the literary world.
Why did this publisher decide now was the right time to start reissuing her work? I feel like the original is influencing a thing that is now influencing the original.
That's so interesting. I hadn't thought about that cyclical nature, but that's exactly right. So Source Books acquired the rights to Georgette Heyer's work in, I believe, 2007 and has done multiple editions. You know, they'll do new covers, they'll do special editions. And when Bridgerton became such a hit on Netflix and the books themselves started selling even more, they realized Georgette Heyer is the original Regency romance author. This is a great moment to reintroduce her, to expand her fan base, to reach younger readers. And at the time that they were thinking of doing this, there was already this debate starting in the literary world and romance in particular about diversity and how to handle diverse cultures. And they realized aspects of her work are not going to resonate with younger readers. These things are going to trip them up. And so they brought in a scholar, Mary Bly, and they eventually got another sensitivity reader to look at her work and see what can we tweak without altering it beyond recognition, without making any dramatic changes, but just to take out anything that might be offensive, and blatantly so, to this new generation of romance fans.
And what was the result? I feel like in the piece that you reported out, there was some tension, particularly with one of the people that they hired as part of this process.
It took a long time. It took them several years to go through this process. They were very careful. And of course, any changes that they made were subject to the approval of Georgette Heyer's estate. And so the publisher could make suggestions. The estate would have to weigh in and make decisions. And I think the question for Mary Bly, who herself is a very well-known romance writer as Eloisa James, and she's also a literary scholar, was how do we do these changes in a way that is transparent? We don't want to cover up the author's original views. We want to tweak the language so that it's not uncomfortable for readers, but we also want to signal what's different. And the publisher was very open to that approach. Originally, Mary Bly was going to write an afterword explaining the changes. And maybe at this point, I should tell you what the changes are.
Because please do.
This is very germane to the whole debate. So what the scene that they were looking at in particular in the Grand Sophie, and it's been a sticking point for readers for a long time. If you look on Goodreads or Amazon, you can see people taking issue with the language in this particular scene. It involves the heroine, Sophie, going to visit a moneylender, and she's trying to recover this debt that her cousin owes. And the moneylender is Jewish. His name is Goldhanger, and he's described in terms that are today are pretty obviously anti-Semitic. And even when the novel was published in 1950, after World War II, even then I think some people might have recognized these stereotypes as anti-Semitic. He's greedy, he's a villain, he is, the way he's described physically, uses some kind of anti-Semitic tropes that were common at the time. And so what Sourcebooks ultimately did was to change his name to Grimstone, which is a funny name, but it's not an obviously Jewish name. And they removed any references to Jews that were sprinkled throughout the novel or in this particular scene to his Semitic appearance, which Georgette Heyer used that kind of language. So in the new version, it is a bad guy who's a moneylender, but not a Jewish moneylender. And so all of those kind of Shakespearean overtones of Shylock and things, that's all gone. And if you read it today and you didn't know the history of the novel, you would never know that anyone ever had a problem with that scene.
I think the arguments for doing something like this are fairly obvious, both from a business standpoint. You don't want to publish language that readers today would find offensive, but also from this is 2023, and maybe if we are interacting with the estate and we have the opportunity to tweak these things, we should do so because it's the right thing to do. However, there are arguments against making any tweaks, making any changes to original text. What are the arguments on that side?
It's a very polarizing subject. So there are many readers who feel that you don't want to cover up the author's views. You want to be aware of what the author thought. You want to know about the historical context. And it's up to readers to either not read the book if that kind of thing would offend them, or read it and judge it accordingly. So that's a very common view. And I think the approach that Sourcebooks was planning to take originally with the afterword was to strike a middle ground that was new and interesting. Eventually, the estate felt that they didn't want an outside voice from a scholar kind of casting judgment or framing the issue for readers. And so they removed the afterword. And so now there's just a new version. You can go to the Heyer website and they will direct you to the original. There's a little note in the front that says this version has been edited with the permission of the Heyer estate. So they do note that on the copyright page, but it's not called out in an obvious way or explained. And so I think that is where some readers have an issue. And that's where Mary Bly, the scholar, had an issue. She eventually left the project over that because she felt, as an academic, she wanted everything to be transparent and explained. But you do also see readers, and you can see this on Goodreads, you can see it in comments on our story and on Twitter, who feel like this is actually an improvement on the original. This was otherwise, apart from this one scene that is an egregious stereotype, it's a very delightful romp of a book that people compared to Jane Austen's Emma. You get swept up in the story and people would get to this one sort of pivotal scene and it would trip them up. And some people would write off Heyer's entire work, all of her other romances, because they would say, well, if this is representative of what she thinks, they don't want anything to do with her. So I think the publisher was really trying to avoid that outcome. And so this is the step they took. And what's interesting is in the UK, the novel is not being changed. So the Heyer estate decided in Britain, the publisher there has this approach where they put a disclaimer, usually on older books, to say we don't endorse this language, but this is what the original said. So there's even this kind of split in the Heyer canon where we have one version in the US and a different one in the UK. And I think that's very representative of the different views on this issue.
And we've seen I feel like splits like that a bunch over the past couple years, and it's related to this conversation that's been happening for a few years now around authors. You alluded to Roald Dahl before. We've seen some of his books tweaked to remove words that present-day audiences might find offensive. A lot of them have to do with negative references to female bodies. There have been books by Agatha Christie that have been worked on to remove ethnic descriptions that are no longer palatable. And then, of course, years ago, you wrote about the stir that was caused when about a half dozen Dr. Seuss books were pulled because of outdated, insensitive depictions of various sorts. How have you noticed through your reporting publishers thinking about these issues?
Yeah, it's fascinating because they're really different approaches. I mean, when it comes to Roald Dahl, it was actually the UK editions that were changed to remove what they felt was insensitive language, caused a huge uproar, people, including Salman Rushdie, condemning it as basically censorship. And the US publisher left them the way they were. So it's the reverse of Heyer. With Dr. Seuss, that was a big controversy. In that case, they didn't edit the books, but rather there were several that they just pulled out entirely from circulation. And so there was an outcry over what people saw as censorship. But it's really, there's competing interests at work here. Publishers and estates both want to keep the books in circulation. They want the authors. These are not only beloved, iconic works, but these are industries almost. Like when you think of all the Roald Dahl movie adaptations, all the Agatha Christie movie adaptations, these are brands. And to keep those brands popular and in the zeitgeist, the decision is often made that we need to adjust them for today's kind of sensitivity standards. And when it came to Agatha Christie's work, I did speak to someone from her estate, and their explanation had a lot to do with the film adaptations. They said, when these movies come out, a whole bunch of new readers will go back to the books. We put out movie editions with new covers, and we know that if there is a racial stereotype in there, a word that is offensive to people now, that's going to turn people off. And these are not essential plot points. They're not rewriting the sentences. It's a very delicate operation. And so that's definitely part, I think, of the calculation is how do we preserve these authors and make sure they're still relevant and continue this commercial juggernaut that we have running without altering them beyond recognition or doing something that's going to create an outcry among fans.
Well, I imagine we are going to continue to see debates over stuff like this over the next couple of years. Let's move to your second story. This was about Rebecca Yarros. Rebecca Yarros is the author of one of the year's surprising bestsellers, Fourth Wing, the sequel to which Iron Flame has just been released. For those listeners who haven't read Fourth Wing yet or read your story, if you haven't, please do so. Alexandra, tell us first what the book is about.
Sure. Fourth Wing, it's exactly like you said. It was one of the surprise breakout blockbusters of the year, and it's tapping into this rise of romantasy, which is a blend of fantasy and romance, and it's attracting readers and fans from both of those genres. And the way Rebecca Yarros approached it, she comes from a military family, and she, for a long time, was a military wife. She has this understanding of military hierarchy, and her idea for Fourth Wing was to create a fantasy about dragon riders who are at an elite war college in this fantasy world. And the romance element is also a really strong plot thread. It's one of those enemies to lovers tropes where two of the writers are attracted to each other, but hate each other, but need each other. And of course, they end up getting together.
And how did Fourth Wing become such a sensation this year? And who is Rebecca Yarros?
That is such a fascinating story because when I saw it pop up on the bestseller list, and this was many months ago, I had never heard of Rebecca Yarros. And it turns out she has been around for quite some time. She's a romance veteran, but she's only written contemporary romance in the past. She's published 20 novels. Many of them are military romances. She's married to a now retired service member who was deployed multiple times. Her parents were both in the military, so she grew up moving around and is very familiar with that world and drew on that in her books. But I didn't know any of that when I picked up the book and read this very elaborate 500-plus page fantasy novel that's really intricately plotted and has all the elements that you would expect from a great fantasy, with the world building, with magic, with political intrigue, with religion, different social classes, and all of this very well mapped out fantasy world. But it's interesting to think about what drove it to the top of the list and kept it there for so long. I think part of it has to do with TikTok. This has become a major way for readers to find books, and this is one of those books that really got a big boost from people on TikTok. It also has to do with, I think her publisher, Entangled, made some really clever marketing decisions. They started with these limited edition hardcovers with beautiful sprayed edges with a dragon pattern, and those sold out right away, and people wanted more, and so they reprinted, and it became this physical object that people would see on TikTok and would want to get. And then I think the whole romantasy craze, it's also lifted the careers of writers like Sarah J. Maas and others. It's really tapping into something that readers are looking for right now, which is both an escape and then a very emotional and romantic element. And the other thing that I think is driving her work to the top of the list more maybe than other romantasy authors is the fact that it's general readers are picking up too. Men and women are picking it up. People of different ages are picking it up. It skews not quite to YA because it's pretty explicit, but it's fairly on the young end. And then all the male readers are into the military and the blood and gore. Apparently, the publisher told me. So it's really attracting this very broad fan base. And the clever thing that they did was to release a sequel the same year. So the sequel is now driving people who hadn't read the first one back to the first one. She's now, I think, on publication day, the sequel, Iron Flame, is #1 on Amazon, and Fourth Wing is up there in the top 10 as well.
Alexandra, one of the interesting scenes in your profile describes something that I feel doesn't happen that much anymore, which is sort of a release party for a book, which used to be a thing, like when the Hunger Games books were coming out, or the Harry Potter books were coming out, or the 50 Shades of Grey books were coming out, used to see more often. And it's been a minute, more than a minute, since that has happened, obviously because of COVID, but also because of changes in the publishing industry. Can you give us a little flavor of what those were like?
So to mark the release of the sequel, Iron Flame, a ton of bookstores, more than several hundred, 200 Barnes & Nobles and a bunch of independents threw midnight release parties, which are a very rare occurrence. And booksellers did tell me this reminds me of Harry Potter or Twilight. There's just this, not only a desire to get the book the second it's on sale at midnight, but a desire to be with other people who also want it and to have that community feeling. And I think it is very much post-COVID, people are looking for that. But it is a huge sign of this fandom that's developing. And I got a little taste of that at Comic-Con last month. I went with Yarros to a book signing at Comic-Con, and the place was packed. People were dressed up as Violet Sorrengail, the main character, wearing full body leather suits with daggers and braids with silver in their hair. People were wearing T-shirts and backpacks that had references to slogans from the book. And it was clear that this is something that people have taken into their own hands. There's a ton of fan art on the internet, and it's very reminiscent of those Harry Potter communities and things. Of course, there's fan fiction already, and this is going to be a 5-book series, so I'm expecting to see the fandom and the sales continue to grow around it.
Alexandra, thank you so much, as always, for coming on the Book Review Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. It was fun talking to you.
We'll be right back. Welcome back. This is the Book Review Podcast, and I'm Gilbert Cruz. I am here now with Alexandra Jacobs, who finally has gotten some sleep after reviewing a 970-page memoir by Barbra Streisand called My Name is Barbra. Alexandra, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Tell us first, big picture, what is your relationship to Barbra Streisand? Am I pronouncing that correctly, by the way?
You might have been a little heavy on the second S. It's pronounced Streisand.
I feel like this is that scene with Bradley Cooper in that Paul Thomas Anderson movie, Streisand, not Streisand. Okay. And she actually, as I note in the review, she called Tim Cook of Apple to have the pronunciation corrected on Siri. So if you ask Siri, it will be done correctly. At the end of this interview, I'm going to put my phone on the table. We're going to say, "Hey Siri," and then see how she responds. It better
be your phone because mine is out of juice.
So what is your relationship to Barbra Streisand?
Well, I got to be honest. For I grew up in the 70s and 80s. Barbra Streisand, to me, was a little bit like wallpaper, like very nice brocade wallpaper in the same way that the Beatles were. And I also rediscovered them through that documentary, but also books. Anyway, this book allowed me to comprehend the full arc of Barbra Streisand in a way that I hadn't before. I always liked her. I always had basically good feelings about her. She was always there. I guess I probably first became aware of her in her adult contemporary WABC radio era where these songs would come on, that duets she'd do with Barry Gibb or whatever. And I liked them. They were earworms. But then later on, Yentl, she was in or in charge of the big movies of the period. Then came Prince of Tides. She was there.
And one of the amazing things about Barbra Streisand, there are many amazing things. She has had a very impressive career. It's just how much of a multi-hyphenate she has been over the course of that career.
Before that was even a word. It's remarkable and unusual.
So let's take a step back. Why is this book, in particular, a memoir, again, of almost 1,000 pages, such a notable event? There are celebrity memoirs all the time.
All the time, and also celebrity biographies all the time. There have been many biographies of Barbra Streisand, and none of them have been authorized, which doesn't necessarily mean there aren't good ones. But this is a woman who is famously, as I note in the review, not meaning it pejoratively, controlling. Looking back on the press about her, some of it is really terrible. Her looks were criticized. Her nose was criticized. Her talent, I think, was always acknowledged, but there was a lot of trying to cut her back for doing too much, sort of thing. So you can understand why she would want to control her own narrative, as it were. And she's 81 now. I think there's a certain no F's left to give quality there. Like, why not?
So, Alexandra, you have read many celebrity memoirs over the year. I was wondering, before we sketch out very briefly the arc of Barbra's life and career, what are the types of celebrity memoirs that one often finds, and how does this fit into sort of those categories?
It's almost like a subgenre, right? Yeah. Well, often a celebrity will want to set the record straight about ways they feel they've been mistreated in the press. We saw the Matthew Perry book, sadly. There are sort of addiction memoirs, redemption tours, recovery tour type things. And then I think some are just pieces of PR. And then often celebrities, often very successful people, have hardship in their childhoods, or they're really working something through. It's almost like a therapy session for them, I think, to get it on the page.
And this one seems like the full arc. I have not had an opportunity to get my hands on the book yet because the copies have been in short supply, but it really seems like this is a soup to nuts, very detailed account of her life. I don't know, did she keep diaries? How did she remember all this stuff? And can you give us, as best you can, given the length of this book, just a brief sketch of her childhood and early career? Absolutely.
And it's funny you should say nuts, because in the review I mentioned that she is extremely thorough, as one might expect of Streisand. There's a chapter on the movie Nuts, which I think most people have forgotten. And that's one of the things I think maybe could have been scaled back just a little bit. But she writes of keeping journals. Now, when I say writes, I had a line in the review, I'm not sure, I think it might have gotten cut at the last minute, but I said told her dictaphone, which is like a little bit of a reference to the character she played in I Can Get It For You Wholesale, Miss Marmalstein. She plays the secretary. It's a little bit of a throwback, but the book really feels, I don't want to say dictated. It's very intimate. It does feel like she's whispering into a microphone, as we are now. There are a lot of ellipses. The paragraphs are very short. But she did keep journals. She has a lot of loyal supporters. Another line I didn't use was that Barbra Streisand was the original ghoster, because she writes more than once of her ability to cut people off if they cross her.
I respect that.
Yeah, I do too. I'm still trying to learn how to do it. But she has a number of people who've been with her for a very long time, including her manager, Marty. So she'll go back to Marty and check on stuff like salary or what she was paid, and he'll remember. So you got to think these are very devoted people. She has an assistant named Renata who she calls upon, and her career began in a recording age. So there are that stuff, a lot of the stuff is on YouTube now. it might not have been as easily recoverable if she was trying to write this book in the 1980s, but now you can go on YouTube and see her performing at the Bonsoir. Maybe not see her at the Bonsoir, but you can hear her at the Bonsoir, and you can see her TV specials, which is quite extraordinary.
And the Bonsoir was a New York club?
Yes, the Bonsoir was a supper club in Greenwich Village. She writes really poignantly of growing up in this housing project in Flatbush, Brooklyn, which was called the Vanderveer Estates, and like with this sort of grand name for really a pretty crummy place. And her father died when she was only 15 months, and you never get over that. Her mother remarried a guy named Kind who was not, and there were 3 children ultimately. And Barbra was, I think today we would call it neglect. I think the mother, she had her own hardships, but she was not very affirming or affectionate. And Barbra was very smart, very good in school, and I really decided she wanted to perform early on. I think she escaped to the movies. She saw The Diary of Anne Frank, which when she was 14, and Anne Frank was 14, or the character was 14. So, I mean, it was really up and up from there. I mean, her putting herself on the map happened very quickly. And what's extraordinary to me is that singing for her was almost an afterthought. You know, she just sang. She had singing lessons once. It's a completely natural, intuitive talent. And that's what really made people fall to their knees and say, you're going to be a star. And of course, her looks were unusual for the time. She got all this advice to get a nose job. She wore all these thrift clothes because that's what she could afford and that's what interested her. She was told to get rid of those. And what's remarkable to me is how she really resisted all that. She was very strong-willed about her image and what she would do and not do.
Alexandra, we could talk for more than an hour about this book, given how much of her life that it tackles. But one of the things that you talk about is how throughout her life, she's been regarded as, quote, controlling. And as you say, that's literally the definition of what a movie director does. And there came a point in her career where she became a movie director, a very well-known movie director. I was wondering how those sections of the book landed with you.
I was impressed again with the resolve and stubbornness with which she moved forward on Yentl, even though her own agent, David Begelman, called Yentl, he's like, why are you doing that Fakalit? This was a word, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but that was one of many Yiddish.
It sounded like a bad word you just said.
Exactly, it does, but it's not. It was on an Isaac Bashevis singer short story, and he's like, why are you doing this? Why are you obsessed with this? And she was, because her father was from an Orthodox Jewish family and was a scholar. So the story of Yentl, I think, really spoke to her because it was a way of her connecting with her father she'd never known. And she pressed ahead with it, and the movie was critically acclaimed and popular and everything, and it was not nominated for the major awards at the Oscars, and there were actual protests about that, which I thought was very interesting.
The sexism that someone as artistically inclined and powerful and single-minded as Streisand was didn't only show up in Yentl. I feel like, if I'm reading your review correctly, there are points
theme
all throughout her career where, as was the Times, not to excuse the Times, but I think any woman that writes a memoir of what it was like to be in show business back then would have their own story. She has a lot of stories.
It's extraordinary. And it to me, it's the most satisfying part of the book to read about these men who dismissed her, demeaned her, undermined her. I mean, she's got letters from Arthur Lawrence, who wrote, I Can Get It For You Wholesale. And she had this bit on stage where she wanted to block it herself. She played a secretary, and her instincts told her, and she was right, that if she sang her big solo number rolling around on the swivel chair, like the one I'm sitting in now, don't worry, I won't do this, the audience would crack up because it's like she's paddling her feet like a duck. And Arthur Lawrence was furious that she would, she'd done that in her audition and they loved it, but he couldn't stand losing control over that number. And he tried to get her to do it a different way, not in the chair. And then she begged him, please. I think she was 19 at the time, or she was extraordinarily young, and she's pushing back on Arthur Lawrence of West Side Story. That's big. And she prevailed, and it stopped the show every night. Then later on the set of Hello, Dolly, Walter Matthau tells her, I have more talent in my farts than you do in your entire body. I cannot believe I got that past the standards desks, Gilbert. I don't know what angel was smiling on me last night.
Everyone does it,
yeah.
Alexandra.
But is it in the New York Times? Usually not. Anyway,
we are a classic publication.
Yes,
you're right.
We're a family publication. Yes. Anyway, that happened. Just stuff like that. There was a co-star that she had an affair with, and when she broke up with him, he wouldn't look at her anymore. He sort of tried to sabotage her performance on stage, which is horrible. Mike Wallace made her cry on 60 Minutes, really belittled her and said, I never liked you 30 years ago or something like that.
Does it feel like she's using these pages to settle those scores, or
Absolutely.
She's just
yeah? And in fact, again, as I mentioned, the book's very intimate. I was surprised sometimes at how intimate. There's a lot of personal detail, some about people who are still alive. I think I noted the Mandy Patinkin. She talks about Mandy Patinkin's behavior on the set of Yentl. And I assume, look, they're both at the stages in their careers where they can laugh at old times or whatever. But it's unusual. Not every famous person writing a book, as you well know, will go there, as they say.
I don't want you to leave without just lightly asking you what it is like as a critic to get a book like this, which is quite lengthy, and have to turn it around in such a short time.
I honestly find it exhilarating. I don't think I could do it every week. But first of all, for a book like this, it's quite digestible despite the length. It wears its length very lightly. So that makes a difference. But it's also very exciting, and I like it.
Publicists, do not take this as a sign that you should send Alexandra more 1,000-page books.
Once or twice a year, it's great. There's nothing like communicating with the news desk at 8 o'clock on a Monday night. Also, a book like this is a news event. It's exhilarating to be given a book ahead of time, a book that's going to make news. It's a great feeling.
What are one or two Barbra Streisand things that you think our listeners should definitely check out if they haven't? Songs, albums, movies.
Everyone should watch Funny Girl, the movie, and perhaps also The Way We Were. And I think the early part of her life is absolutely fascinating. So I'd recommend that. And also she did a classical album, which is very interesting, that Glenn Gould had very kind words for. So if you want the deep cut, that's where I'd go.
Every Christmas season, every holiday season, in the days after Thanksgiving, my family puts the tree up and we take out the Christmas vinyl. And one of them is the Barbra Streisand
You're kidding.
Christmas album.
Well, you got to love that because she and many of the Christmas songwriters, of course, are Jewish.
Life is wonderfully complicated. Alexandra, as always, thank you so much for coming on.
I'm verklempt. Thank you, Gilbert.
Those were my conversations with Alexandra and Alexandra. Alexandra Alter talking about two wonderful reported pieces that she's published recently, and Alexandra Jacobs on her review of the new Barbra Streisand memoir. I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review. Thanks for listening.